The grand conference hall at the University of Chicago Law School fell completely silent. The air was heavy with anticipation as Judge Richard Posner, one of the most distinguished legal figures in the United States, sat stiffly behind the podium. His sharp eyes, known for catching every flaw in an argument, now showed clear disbelief. Only moments earlier he had openly dismissed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, calling her little more than a politician pretending to be a lawyer. Yet now, standing poised and confident before the microphone with a thick folder of legal files in her hands, Crockett was about to turn the entire room upside down. "Judge Posner," she began calmly, her voice steady, professional, and clear. "You questioned my legal credentials. You suggested I'm just a politician who claims to understand the law." She paused for a moment before continuing, "Well, allow me to share something with you, and with this distinguished audience, that might change your mind." The atmosphere was electric. Every eye in the hall was fixed on her. Law students leaned forward eagerly, professors adjusted their glasses, and legal journalists prepared to capture every word. This wasn't an ordinary academic event. It was a clash of intellects, a test of professional credibility that would soon become one of the most unforgettable moments in modern legal history. Within the next 20 minutes, what unfolded would leave Judge Posner speechless. Elevate Congresswoman Crockett's reputation as a legal mind, and spark one of the most discussed showdowns in legal academia. Before we get deeper into this intense exchange, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more exclusive videos on political and legal confrontations you won't find anywhere else. To truly understand the weight of this face-off, let's first explore who these two powerful figures really are. Judge Richard Posner had spent more than 30 years as one of America's most influential federal judges. At 84, his impact on the legal world remained monumental. He had authored over 3,000 judicial opinions and written more than 40 books on law and economics. Known for his razor-sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach, Posner had built a reputation for brilliance mixed with blunt honesty. Supporters admired his insight. Critics accused him of arrogance. Still, nearly everyone agreed he was one of the greatest legal thinkers of his generation. Though retired from the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, his influence continued to shape legal education across the nation. Universities still taught his landmark opinions. His writings remained mandatory reading in graduate programs. When Judge Posner spoke about the law, people listened carefully. But despite his achievements, Posner held a long-standing disdain for politicians who claimed legal expertise. For years he had criticized what he called political lawyers, elected officials who, in his eyes, used their law degrees as a badge of credibility but abandoned real legal thinking for political convenience. To him, there was a clear line between practicing lawyers devoted to courtroom work and politicians who merely carried the title. Standing on the other side of this intellectual duel was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, proudly representing Texas's 30th District. At 43, Crockett had already built an impressive career. Before entering politics, she had made her mark as a civil rights attorney, fighting passionately for justice and equality. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she had spent over a decade practicing law in Texas courts. Yet, her move into politics led some traditional legal scholars to question whether she still belonged in the realm of real lawyers. What few people realized, including Judge Posner himself, was that Crockett had never truly left the practice of law. Even while serving in Congress, she continued to handle select pro bono cases, focusing on constitutional rights and civil liberties. Much of her legal work happened quietly and without publicity, but her record spoke volumes. She had won significant cases that upheld justice for marginalized communities and demonstrated a deep understanding of complex legal principles. The now famous confrontation took place during a symposium titled Law and Politics in Modern America. The event brought together federal judges, respected professors, and key political figures to discuss how legal thinking interacts with political decision-making. What began as an academic conference was about to evolve into something far more intense. Judge Posner was the keynote speaker, and his presentation was titled "The Decline of Legal Thought in Political Discourse." His speech targeted what he viewed as the growing trend of politicians distorting legal arguments for political gain. When the Q&A session opened, Congresswoman Crockett approached the microphone. She had been invited to provide a political perspective, but she wanted to engage Judge Posner's arguments strictly through the lens of law. Her first question was detailed and insightful, referencing a recent Supreme Court decision on constitutional interpretation. Posner's response, however, was cutting. He brushed off her question, suggesting that politicians rarely grasp the true complexities of constitutional law because they focus more on political outcomes than legal reasoning. At this point, viewers and attendees alike could sense the tension. And for those watching this story later, we want to ask you, have you ever seen someone's skills or expertise underestimated, only for them to completely turn the tables? Tell us your story in the comments below. We love hearing moments when the underdog rises to the top. Crockett didn't back down. She followed up with a second question, this time about fellow appellate procedures and their potential influence on pending legislation. Once again, Judge Posner dismissed her point condescendingly. He implied that her question revealed a lack of understanding of how the federal courts functioned in practice. Then came the remark that stunned the entire room. Looking straight at Crockett, Judge Posner said, "Congresswoman, with all due respect, you're what I would call a fake lawyer. Yes, you have a law degree, but you're really just a politician now. You've abandoned serious legal thought for political theater. I doubt you've stepped into a courtroom or written a meaningful legal brief in years." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Professors shifted awkwardly in their chairs. Law students exchanged uneasy glances. This was no longer an academic critique. It was a personal attack on Crockett's intelligence and professional integrity. Many politicians would have reacted defensively or tried to justify their credentials. But Jasmine Crockett did something entirely different. She smiled softly, walked back to her seat, and picked up the large folder she had brought along. The audience could feel that something monumental was about to happen. What came next would not only silence one of America's most famous judges, but also forever change how people viewed Jasmine Crockett, not just as a congresswoman, but as a sharp, fearless, and brilliant legal mind who refused to be underestimated. Judge Posner. Crockett began as she returned to the microphone, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your honesty, and I think this moment gives us the perfect chance to have an honest discussion about what it truly means to possess legal expertise, and what being a practicing attorney in today's America actually looks like." The audience immediately fell silent again. Something about her tone was different, composed yet powerful. Everyone could sense that this wasn't going to be a routine political comeback filled with talking points. She wasn't going to defend herself with words alone. What she was about to do would catch everyone, including Judge Posner, completely off guard. With deliberate care, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett opened the thick folder she had carried onto the stage. The audience could see how neatly everything inside was arranged. Stacks of papers separated by colored tabs and bound like formal court filings. It was instantly clear this was not a prop meant for show. It was the meticulous work of a serious practicing lawyer. "Judge Posner," she continued, locking eyes with him, "you said I haven't stepped into a courtroom in years. You claimed I no longer write serious legal briefs. You even called me a fake lawyer." Her tone remained steady, but there was unmistakable strength in every word. "I'd like to respond to those claims not with rhetoric, but with evidence." She pulled out the first document from her folder. 3 months ago, I argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Henderson v. Texas Department of Education. The case involved constitutional questions about equal protection in school funding. Holding up the brief for everyone to see, she added, "This is the brief I personally wrote and filed. It cites 47 federal cases, offers original constitutional analysis, and presents new arguments on how the 14th Amendment intersects with state education policy." The three-judge panel accepted our reasoning unanimously. A visible shift spread across Judge Posner's face. He leaned forward slightly, the dismissive expression fading as curiosity began to take over. "But that's just one example," Crockett said, retrieving another document. "6 months ago, I represented a coalition of voting rights advocates in federal district court in Martinez v. Dallas County. The case challenged newly introduced voting procedures that unfairly impacted minority communities. Here's the motion for a preliminary injunction that I personally drafted." Turning toward Posner again, she continued confidently, "This motion required deep analysis of Supreme Court precedent on voting rights, statistical data on disparate impact, and constitutional reasoning based on both the Equal Protection Clause and the Voting Rights Act." The federal judge not only granted our motion but also commended the quality and clarity of our legal arguments. The audience was transfixed. Law students took frantic notes. Professors whispered to one another in disbelief. No one had expected this. The congresswoman who had been mocked as a fake lawyer was now methodically proving her credibility with irrefutable evidence, but Crockett was far from finished. She reached for a third document even thicker than the ones before. "Last year," she said, "I handled a pro bono immigration case, Ramirez v. Department of Homeland Security. This case demanded complex understanding of administrative law, constitutional due process, and international treaty obligations." She raised the document slightly. "This brief is 89 pages long. It includes original legal arguments that had never before been presented in federal court, exploring the relationship between asylum protections and constitutional rights for families." The presiding judge described it as exemplary legal scholarship and ruled in favor of our client. By this point, Judge Posner wasn't hiding his reaction. His eyes were fixed on the papers, his earlier arrogance replaced with genuine interest. A man who had spent decades evaluating legal arguments could instantly recognize the authenticity of what he was seeing. Crockett wasn't done yet. "But Judge Posner," she said evenly, "you didn't only question my recent legal work. You also claim that politicians like me don't understand how federal courts truly function." She flipped to another section of her folder, pulling out a series of filed documents. "Allow me to clarify that as well." Holding the stack up for the audience, she continued. "Over the past 2 years, while serving full-time in Congress, I've filed briefs in federal courts across Texas, Louisiana, and Illinois. I've argued motions before magistrates, district judges, and appellate panels. I've won injunctions, survived motions to dismiss, and successfully appealed adverse rulings." The silence in the room deepened. There was no denying the truth. These were real cases, real filings, and real victories. Nothing about what she was showing could be dismissed as political performance. And most importantly, she added, every one of these cases has been handled pro bono. I don't take a single dollar in fees because my congressional salary allows me to represent clients who would otherwise have no access to qualified federal litigation counsel. Judge Posner removed his glasses and began polishing them with a handkerchief, a gesture well known among his colleagues as a sign of deep reflection. He had clearly underestimated her. Then Crockett reached for one final document. "Judge Posner," she said, "there's one last case I believe you'll find particularly meaningful." She lifted a bound petition. "Just 3 weeks ago, I filed this petition for certiorari with the United States Supreme Court in Thompson v. Federal Bureau of Prisons. Even from several rows away, attendees could see how professional it looked, properly bound, formatted according to Supreme Court rules, and stamped with official filing marks. This petition raises an important constitutional question regarding the Eighth Amendment and federal prison conditions," she explained. "It required extensive study of prior Supreme Court rulings, detailed analysis of circuit splits, and development of new constitutional theory." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The magnitude of what she had just revealed hit the audience like a wave. Filing a petition for certiorari before the U.S. Supreme Court is among the most complex and demanding tasks any lawyer can undertake. It requires absolute command of constitutional law, procedural precision and intellectual mastery, all qualities Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had just proven she possessed beyond question. The petition was officially accepted for filing by the Clerk of the United States Supreme Court without a single request for revision or correction. Every detail followed the court's strict procedural rules perfectly, and the arguments it contained were unlike anything the justice had reviewed before. Judge Posner, who had initially dismissed her, now leaned forward in his chair, visibly intrigued despite himself. Around the room, total silence reigned. Everyone knew they were witnessing something remarkable, a moment of genuine legal brilliance unfolding before their eyes. Now, Judge Posner, Crockett said respectfully, her tone measured yet unwavering, I'd like to return to the remarks you made earlier. The room grew even quieter. You called me a fake lawyer. You said I'd traded serious legal thinking for political theater. You suggested I no longer understood how real courts function. She gestured toward the organized stack of documents spread across the table in front of her. What I've shown you today demonstrates active participation in federal litigation, successful courtroom advocacy, complex constitutional writing, and engagement with the highest levels of the federal judiciary. This isn't theater. This is law practiced at the most demanding level. The entire dynamic of the confrontation had changed. What began as Judge Posner publicly dismissing a congresswoman had turned into a masterclass in professional credibility. Jasmine Crockett had just demonstrated a command of law that even many career attorneys would envy. The only question remaining was how one of America's most respected judicial thinkers would respond to being so publicly proven wrong. The silence stretched on for nearly 30 seconds. Judge Posner sat perfectly still, staring down at the pile of evidence before him. Finally, he reached for his microphone. His tone, when he spoke, was completely transformed from the sharp, dismissive voice he had used earlier. Congresswoman Crockett, he began slowly, I owe you an apology. The audience exhaled all at once, some whispering in disbelief. Few had ever seen Judge Posner, a man known for his intellectual pride and refusal to admit mistakes, concede anything so directly. When I called you a fake lawyer, he continued, I was relying on assumptions rather than facts. That kind of careless judgment is exactly the kind of intellectual shortcut I've spent my entire career warning others to avoid. I was wrong and I was unfair. But Crockett wasn't finished. She had spent months anticipating this very kind of challenge, aware that someone from the old guard of the legal establishment would eventually question her credentials. She took a deep breath and looked directly at the judge. Judge Posner, I accept your apology, she said graciously. But I think this exchange highlights something much bigger than just a misunderstanding between the two of us. It reflects a broader issue in how our profession defines expertise and competence. Closing her folder but keeping her place at the microphone, she continued, You assume that because I'm a politician, I must have abandoned serious legal work. But that assumption says more about our collective biases than it does about anyone's actual skill or knowledge. She turned to face the audience now, speaking with the confidence of someone who knew the truth was on her side. How many exceptional lawyers are ignored because they don't fit traditional molds? How many sharp legal minds are underestimated because they choose to work outside the narrow boundaries of courtroom practice? Judge Posner nodded slowly, visibly humbled. You're right, he admitted. I fell into the exact kind of categorical thinking I've criticized throughout my career. I saw the title politician and stopped seeing the lawyer behind it. Crockett nodded in appreciation but pressed on. And there's another point I want to make, she said. The legal work I've presented here represents only a small part of what lawyers in unconventional roles are accomplishing across this country. She began pacing slowly, her voice gaining strength. There are former prosecutors serving as senators who use their courtroom experience to craft criminal justice reform. There are civil rights lawyers in state offices writing legislation grounded in deep constitutional reasoning. Legal thinking doesn't stop at the courthouse doors. It evolves and takes new forms wherever justice needs it. Reaching into her folder one final time, Crockett retrieved a different kind of document, not a brief or court filing, but a piece of legislative text. "Judge Posner," she said, "this is a bill I personally drafted for Congress. The Federal Court Efficiency Act. It's designed to address the very procedural inefficiencies you've discussed in your own writings about judicial administration." Posner's eyes widened. He had indeed written extensively on that subject in his book How Judges Think and in multiple law review articles. "This bill," Crockett explained, "builds directly upon the principles you've advocated. It incorporates insights from your scholarship and applies them to real-world reform. It's not about political compromise. It's about translating rigorous legal thought into practical policy." She handed the document to a law student sitting in the front row, who quickly passed it up to the stage. Judge Posner took the papers and began scanning them closely. His face shifted once again, this time, not with disbelief but with respect. The text was not just legislative in nature. It reflected deep, technical understanding of how federal courts function. The proposed law included provisions for expanding alternative dispute resolution programs, revising discovery procedures using data-driven research, and allocating judicial resources more efficiently according to case complexity. Crockett's explanation was precise and professional. "Every section of this bill," she said, "is backed by constitutional reasoning, empirical data, and established legal scholarship. Nothing here is written for show, it's crafted for real-world impact." Judge Posner looked up slowly from the document, his voice soft but sincere. This is serious work," he said. "These reforms directly address problems I've identified for years within the federal court system." Crockett nodded slightly. "Judge Posner, throughout your career, you've argued that the law should be grounded in practicality, evidence, and measurable outcomes, not abstract theory. That's exactly what I'm trying to do, combine rigorous legal reasoning with effective policymaking." The audience sat in awe. What they had just witnessed was not simply a debate, but a redefining moment. A rare and powerful reminder that true legal mastery transcends titles, politics, and assumptions. The petition was officially filed and accepted by the Clerk of the United States Supreme Court without a single correction or request for revision. Every line followed the court's strict filing rules perfectly, and the legal arguments within were unlike anything the justices had ever reviewed. Judge Posner, who had earlier dismissed her credentials, now leaned forward, visibly drawn in. The entire room was silent. Everyone could feel that they were watching something truly exceptional unfold before them. "Judge Posner," Crockett began calmly, returning to the microphone, her tone respectful but firm. "I'd like to revisit what you said earlier." The silence deepened. "You called me a fake lawyer? You said I'd traded serious legal analysis for political performance. You implied that I no longer understand how real courts operate." She motioned toward the stack of neatly arranged documents before her. "Everything I've shown you today proves active federal litigation, successful courtroom advocacy, detailed constitutional writing, and engagement with the highest levels of our judiciary. This isn't theater. This is law practiced at its most demanding level." The atmosphere had completely changed. What started as Judge Posner publicly dismissing a congresswoman had turned into a powerful display of genuine legal expertise. Jasmine Crockett had just shown mastery of her craft that many longtime attorneys could only admire. The only question left was how one of America's most respected judicial figures would respond after being so clearly proven wrong. Nearly half a minute passed before anyone moved. Judge Posner sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the evidence laid out before him. At last he reached for his microphone. When he spoke, his voice was unrecognizable from the sharp, dismissive tone of earlier. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began slowly, "I owe you an apology." The audience collectively exhaled. Murmurs rippled through the room. It was rare to see Judge Posner, known for his intellectual pride and unwillingness to admit mistakes, offer such a direct concession. "When I called you a fake lawyer," he continued, "I was speaking from assumptions instead of facts. That kind of careless judgment is exactly what I've spent my life warning others to avoid. I was wrong and I was unfair. But Crockett wasn't finished. She had long anticipated this kind of confrontation, knowing that sooner or later someone from the traditional legal establishment would question her credibility. She took a calm breath, meeting the judge's eyes. "Judge Posner, I appreciate your apology," she said sincerely. "But I think this conversation highlights something larger than a disagreement between us. It exposes a much deeper issue about how our profession defines expertise and competence." She closed her folder but remained at the microphone. "You assume that because I'm a politician, I must have left serious legal work behind. But that assumption says more about our biases than about anyone's actual skill or integrity." Crockett turned to address the audience, her voice steady and confident. "How many remarkable attorneys are dismissed simply because they don't fit traditional molds? How many sharp legal thinkers are overlooked because they choose to work outside conventional courtroom settings?" Judge Posner nodded slowly, humbled. "You're right," he admitted. "I fell into the very kind of categorical thinking I've criticized my entire life. I saw the title politician and failed to see the layer behind it." Crockett nodded appreciatively but continued. "And there's another important truth," she said. "The cases I've shown today are just a small part of what lawyers in non-traditional roles are doing across this country." She began pacing slightly, her tone growing more powerful. "There are former prosecutors in Congress using their courtroom experience to create meaningful criminal justice reform. There are civil rights lawyers in state governments crafting policies rooted in constitutional reasoning. Legal expertise doesn't stop at the courthouse doors, it evolves wherever justice needs it." Then Crockett pulled out one final document, not a legal brief, but a piece of legislation. "Judge Posner," she said, "this is a bill I personally wrote. The Federal Court Efficiency Act. It's designed to fix the same procedural inefficiencies you've highlighted in your writings on judicial reform." Posner's expression changed instantly. He had written about that very topic in his book, How Judges Think, and in several law journal articles. "This bill," Crockett explained, "builds directly on your ideas. It takes the theories from your scholarship and transforms them into practical, actionable reforms. This isn't political theater, it's applied legal analysis." A student in the front row passed the document up to the stage. Judge Posner took it, scanning the pages closely. His face softened as he read. What he saw was not merely legislation, it reflected deep understanding of how federal courts actually function. The proposal included expansions for alternative dispute resolution programs, revised discovery processes backed by data, and smarter judicial resource allocation based on case complexity. Crockett spoke with clarity and precision. "Every section of this bill," she said, "is grounded in constitutional reasoning, supported by data and informed by leading scholarship. None of this was written for show, it's meant to create lasting reform." Judge Posner finally looked up, his tone quiet but sincere. This is serious work," he said. "These reforms address real problems I've identified for decades." Crockett nodded. "Judge Posner, throughout your career, you've argued that the law should be practical, evidence-based, and focused on real-world impact, not abstract theory. That's exactly what I'm working toward, blending strong legal reasoning with effective policymaking." The audience remained completely silent, captivated. What they had witnessed wasn't just a debate, it was a defining moment. It proved that true legal brilliance isn't confined by titles or institutions, but revealed through dedication, intellect, and integrity.